Being that it's 7 o'clock on April 3rd, I'd like to open up the planning board meeting. Welcome, everyone. First item on the agenda is review and approval of the minutes from 2/20 and 3/20/18.
Okay, I'll make a motion that we accept the minutes from February 20th, 2018 as submitted.
Second?
Can I ask, before we do that, can I ask a question?
Yep.
I thought we previously approved these. No?
No, because I knew I was behind.
No, the 20th we didn't do.
The February 20th, we did not do.
We did do two sets, though, at the last meeting, so it had to be from January.
We did something that was February 16th, which I didn't quite understand. I was looking back at the records.
Well, we had a spare meeting.
At the March 6th meeting, it said, Mr. King motions to approve the minutes of the meeting held February 16th, as written. And I was trying to figure out, where were those minutes?
16th?
Yeah.
It should have said February 6th.
Ah, that's why I was confused. So in the minutes on March 6th, minutes, it says, under approval of minutes, it says, Mr. King motions to approve the minutes of the meeting held February 16th. So that should have said February 6th? Okay. That's, all right. And then this is the 20th. So when I saw the 16th, I said, gee, why are we doing the 20th? Okay, I understand now.
But you know what? We should take a correcting vote. We should.
Make a
and
motion.
We can make a motion today.
Except with correction.
To make a corrective motion to approve the minutes of February 6th, as written.
Well, it's the minutes of March 6th. And within those minutes, I can give this to you. It says approval of minutes. It says Mr. King motions to approve the minutes of the meeting held February 16th. And I got confused because I knew we were doing the 20th tonight. Now, it was only 4 days difference.
Yeah,
and I
you
was-
could
Right.
know.
So,
move to amend and
so
correct.
I'm going to make a motion and move to amend our vote to approve the minutes of February 16th, as that date we did not have a meeting. And I make a motion that we approve the minutes of February 6th, when we did have that meeting, as written.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
And we also have the motion and second for the 20th.
There's a motion and a second for February 20th.
You can pass that down. That's what I was
Thanks.
just noting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And I make a motion that we accept the minutes from March 20th, 2018 as submitted.
Second?
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Submission of new plans. Seeing none, we have some old business, Winterberry Lane.
Right. Winterberry Lane submitted a request to withdraw without prejudice, so that needs the approval of the planning board.
Make a motion to accept the withdrawal of the modification to Kristen's Way subdivision plan
Second.
without prejudice.
Yeah, after the public hearing has to be without prejudice.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So moved. Okay, so there's no new business, so we go right to exterior storage units.
If I may?
Please.
Thank you. The last meeting we had was the public hearing, and a couple of issues were brought up. So just for your discussion this evening, I put forth in front of you the proposed bylaw, and underneath that, the definitions, the revised definition which we put forward, and underneath that, the town bylaw of unregistered vehicle storage. And the reason why I put that in, again, as you may recall, some people brought up some issues about, if I have a van in my yard, if I have a farm vehicle in my yard. So when we went through the minutes, I sort of broke down the issues on the next page through the issues that were presented at the public forum, just hopefully as points of discussion for you. The first couple, which would deal with registration, vehicle registration, the next one with personal property, and the bottom one as other. Then additionally, it seems like the big issue which people had were with the, I'm going to call it the Connex containers. That's the commercial name for those for those storage, I don't know, storage vehicles, storage units. So I went onto the Connex website so you would have an idea of what they look like. The issue was with people, they purchased them. They're traditionally purchased for industrial reasons. People were purchasing them for personal reasons, and they've become personal property. And lastly was I just made another copy of the flow chart that Bob Prohl presented. So, the hopes are to see if we could get some more guidance from the planning board, so we could start working on a bylaw. Also, some issues were brought up regarding accessory buildings, personal property, how it was going to be enforced, and you had asked the building inspector, Paul Spiro, to attend this meeting, so we have both the building inspector, Paul Spiro, and the assistant building inspector, Brendan Brides, in case you have some questions about how we define accessory structures. If you so choose to go down the path as a Connex, the Connex thing as an accessory structure, so I think Paul and Brendan can respond to those questions.
Thank you, Ralph.
Sure.
So we got a lot of input from the public last meeting, and they seem to be quite concerned about their trailers being parked on their property. They didn't want those to be taken away after 9 months, or so that was a stumbling block as I saw it. I think we almost need 2 bylaws and 2 definitions. One bylaw dealing with temporary storage units, and one bylaw regulating these Connex containers, which is essentially a shed. And the 2 definitions would be describing the Connex containers as a shed, or however we decide, and the other definition would be describing the temporary pod unit that you would keep in the front yard or anywhere on your property for up to 9 months. So, we got any board discussion on? Anybody thought of any ideas?
Yeah, I put the flow chart together only because I was having a hard time wrapping my mind around how do you classify something in a way where it makes sense to everybody, and I felt like if we try to identify, like someone mentioned about how if you say pod, well, pod is a brand name, Connex is a brand name, so I think that if we're too specific in relation to what these buildings are, it's going to be not as good for the community as if can kind of come up with some guidelines that help people understand what can and can't you have in the yard. So what I put together was to say, okay, if things are on wheels or it's a boat, the town has nothing to do with that. That's RMV, right? The state already has rules in place for that. And then I looked at Wareham and a couple other towns in the area that had what I thought were, fairly well-worded rules, and tried to, work off of that a little bit. So what they had is like a certain number of feet. If it's under a certain number of feet, it's treated one way. If it's over a certain number of feet, it's treated another way. And then, so I tried to make sure that we didn't have all these, well, what if I have a plastic shed from Lowe's? Or what if I have a trailer on wheels that's not registerable? So I just think I started out this exercise thinking it was a bad idea to even try to write the rules. But after putting this together, I thought, okay, maybe we could write something which is clear and enforceable, clearer than I'm speaking right now, I hope. That's my thought.
Yes, I wanted to ask Paul and Brendan a few questions, if I could. Some of the questions that were brought up at the hearing was, well, just use Connex as an example. The question came that people in the audience are asking is why, if I buy a Connex and put it in my yard, why is it not treated like a shed? And their argument was, in many ways, it's better than a shed. You know, it's more durable, you know, unlike a shed which might, you know, start to rot out, or paint's peeling, you know, that, you know, it could be a lot more pleasing than some of the other items that, you know, get put in the yard that people complain about. So that was one question. That was a good question. I don't know, you know, a Connex, if I think about a Connex unit, which is a, you know, rectangular box, or pod, which is a rectangular item, their question was, why doesn't that fall under the shed? Why can't it fall under a shed? So that's one question I have. Have you thought, has that question ever come up before against the shed regulation, and how's it been handled?
First, I just want to step back.
Okay.
Just a bit. May I speak into the microphone? Sure. I'm not loud enough? Thank you. I think if we back up just a bit, we get a whole host of what we call express permits for the construction or placement of sheds. We get a handful to maybe 2 handfuls of complaints per year for a neighbor complaining that someone has an ugly, you name it, being used for storage. So it's not like this is a thing that Brendan and I have to deal with on a weekly basis. I think we can agree on that. So it's very difficult if we would try to get a definition of, you know, every separate thing that we deal with in the bylaw. The bylaw would be so voluminous that Lord knows we couldn't read it. It's tough enough now that we're dealing with thousands of pages of building codes, et cetera, and we certainly don't need this book to get, hundreds and hundreds of pages long. Every few months I teach continuing education for contractors. And one of the first things I bring up is the 1968 Sandwich Protective Bylaw. Included in that, I should have brought it this evening, included in that book is the Historic District Regulations and the Building Code. And it is a book the size of your pocket, and it has about 15 pages in it. And the point I'm trying to make is that it was a lot simpler then. We certainly have a lot more products now. But let me answer your question. What's the difference between a Connex container or unit and a shed? I think commonly, if someone would think of a shed, they would think of that, 10 by 12, 16 by 18 structure that's built or placed on their lot. And it has a couple of windows with some window boxes, and it has a double door with a ramp, so that, tools come out of, power equipment. It could be used as a potting shed, or you name whatever you want to store it as. And that is a commonly known shed. A container is a metal, usually corrugated metal type of unit that also stores things. And I think, personally speaking, I think it's easy, for the building department to distinguish between a storage unit and a shed. It's the common use of that shed is what I think commonly all think of a shed, how we think of a shed. Here's the rub. The rub is this, is that if I live north of Route 6, I have to go before the Historic Committee to get a shed, okay? I've never seen an application to put a container, storage unit. And it would seem to me, after, staff discussed this, if I'm south of Route 6, I don't have to ask anyone. I could just put a storage unit in my side yard or wherever I was going to put it, or I can put a shed there and get the requisite permit. Now, I say the requisite permit for the shed because of the fact that when someone gets a shed, they come to us for that express permit with a plot plan, because it's important, and it's addressed in our bylaw, that that shed comply with zoning setbacks. Okay, there's nothing in the bylaw that refers to the setbacks for a container or a storage bin or unit, however you want to call it. So I know that if someone north of Route 6 wants to get a storage container, they're probably going to have a tough time getting it, because I'm pretty sure the Historic Committee is not going to look favorably upon issuing a certificate of appropriateness for the historic district, which would not be fair to the people south of Route 6. So in an effort to try to make this a bit fair, we were, struggling with, as the board is now, and how do we address this when we get that handful or two handfuls of complaints? Because right now, there's nothing in there that talks about a storage container. You talk about sheds. We talk about campers. That's addressed. So we're between a rock and a hard place when we get a call from someone who's upset that, they're looking out their window and they're seeing this gray, yellow, beige, pick a color, container. And right now, there's nothing that we could do. What we have done in the past, I know that there have been a few times that, a person had a hoarding disorder, and on their property, they had a couple of these containers. So the only thing that the building department would do at that time, because Lord knows the neighbors don't speak to each other. So we're the intermediaries generally that go down and knock on the door, and we ask about their container or whatever they have there that may be objectionable to their neighbor. And sometimes it works that they say, oh, geez, I'm just going to have it here for 3 or 4 more weeks or a month and a half. I'm remodeling this, and that's fine. At least we know now we can go back and speak to that neighbor as the intermediary to let them know what's going on next door and how long perhaps they can expect that that container or whatever it is going to remain there. So if the person who we knock on the door becomes a bit, not belligerent, but a bit, feisty, how we have to sometimes, but, what happens then is that we, again, ask nicely, and sometimes the door could get shut, and, it's none of your business, and then we walk away. We have no teeth, to send the letter to say, look at, there's a violation of bylaw, 4130, whatever it is, and if you would kindly give us a call so that we can remedy this in an amicably, and if you feel aggrieved by my determination or the building department's determination, they have a right to appeal out of the bylaws. So I know that's a long definition, the difference between a connex and a shed, but to get back to where I was, a shed is what we would normally think of as that, Pine Harbor or someone building something on your property and it being attached to the ground for some, in some fashion, in a container that is just, dropped off by a roll-off truck that might be there for, 3 months, 6 months, whatever. And we do provide a little for that in the bylaw, because if someone had some sort of calamity with their property by fire or damage or anything, we do allow for mobile home to be placed on the site, at which point in time any personal effects that were saved could go in that type of a storage container, pod, you name it. So I think there is a distinct difference. I think the toughest part is how do you put that on paper without Brendan and I having, so much, levity in, what is right and what is wrong through the eyes of, two building inspectors.
Yeah, part of the question from the group was, why, I'm sorry, part of the question from the group was why a Connex unit, why one couldn't go pull a shed permit and use a Connex as a shed? It has doors that open, they're gonna bring their ladders and their lawnmowers in and out, and they're gonna bring, their tables and garden chairs and things of that nature.
Right.
And how's that, other than look, how's that any different than I buy one of these plastic resin units from Lowe's and it comes in a box and I set it up and I've got a shed and, it has doors and, many of them don't have windows, but they do have, doors on it and so forth. If, that meets it, why can't I purchase a Connex unit and put it there under a shed permit? And if I can, their argument was, do we really need a bylaw? We already have a bylaw. We've got a shed bylaw. If it's going to be quote-unquote a temporary unit, but it's going to be there forever, just cover it under the shed.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's no definition of what a shed actually is. And it's really, if one person perceives the Connex container as functioning as a shed, then it's hard to argue and say that it's not a shed. And it's certainly they could apply for, I think, for a shed permit for a container, provided it meets the required setbacks. There's an element of common sense that we're kind of relying on in a neighborhood. You don't want to look out and see a container in your next door neighbor's yard, but obviously that's not something that we can regulate. So
of these handful of complaints you get, how many of those are in historic districts and how many are not, percentage-wise? Just understand.
I would say it's rare, if ever, that we got a complaint about a shed in a historic district. Would you agree?
We haven't, I don't believe we've received a complaint for any sheds, because they could be backed up by a permit, and we go out and actually check this, without a survey instruments, we triangulate off of their house with a plot plan to ensure that it's on the proper side of the
So I guess my question
zoning
was,
bylaw.
is temporary, when someone comes in and complains that they're looking at something in a neighbor's yard, is that predominantly, is it in the historic district outside? Is it half out in there? So I'm
Yeah,
trying
the
to-
only complaints I've received, Bob, from, in the historic district would be a container that was part of a commercial operation. And right now, we have one down at the Sandwich Antique Center, and we received some complaints in that regard. I went down and I spoke to the owner, and he, it was very difficult for that business owner because of the fact that he goes to estate sales and he, found a treasure trove of one estate, and he has no room in his facility, and that's why he got the storage container. At which point in time I said, well, okay, how long do you think it's going to be here? And he gave me a rough idea, and I said, fine, thank you for understanding why I came down and knocked on your door.
Yeah.
So there's another one up on Route 6A. There's a couple of storage containers behind another antique dealer that has them pretty well hidden off of the left side of their property, and they don't have any space.
Yeah, and I mean, the rule that we had deliberated in the last meeting was, or had the public hearing about, specifically did not apply to commercial property, so it wouldn't even impact the,
Yeah, and that, and I guess I should have qualified, that was the only container complaints that we've received in the historic district.
So it's like number-wise, I'm trying to get an idea of what problem are we trying to solve, and if it's only a few complaints a year, maybe it's not a problem that's worth all the time to try to rate something to make it clear. So like numbers-wise, how many complaints a year do you think you get total for?
Well, it all depends how big my handful and your handful is and what our two handfuls are.
Well, I think the important question is, do you get enough of them that you feel you need some teeth to take care of what you see as a big enough problem that it shouldn't just be overlooked because it's so few people.
Yeah, Bob, it is few people, okay? For the totality of the population of the town, yes, it is. It's just, when we receive something, we want to try to react. So if we receive a complaint from a neighbor, that the neighbor is, in their perception, they are seeing this, that, or the other thing, then we would try to help that neighbor out. With there's no bylaw, it's almost like that citizen has, all of a sudden relinquished all of their, right to complain about something because there's nothing that is written for them so that we could cite someone. And I don't mean, that's a horrible word, to cite someone. To send a letter, a friendly letter regarding a bylaw. And more often than not, when we write a letter or knock on a door, the person who may be in violation wasn't aware of the bylaw. Okay? So, there isn't a lot, Bob, for sure, okay? And, so I know this is always a struggle to try to define and try to put the bylaw in for this particular point anyways.
So, I mean, really what the, I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that before we get too into the minutia of any more of the discussion of the Connex versus the shed, our problem as a planning board, we are never going to be able to pass a temporary storage bylaw in this town if we don't come up with some kind of wording for permanent storage containers. It's never going to go. Someone at town meeting is going to start that argument of, I own this, it's my personal property. I'm a small business owner. I can't afford to rent space down in the Jan Sebastian, so I've got this container that I bought for $3,000, and this is where I'm doing my,
Electrical bill.
whatever, blacksmithing or whatever. And we got to come up with something to address that before we can ever think of passing a temporary storage container bylaw.
And I,
So Sarah, if I could, just along that note, one, split in two parts. One was, if they purchase it and if they're commercial business, it's not under this, because it's commercial property, which is not under this.
as long as
No, I'm just saying they may purchase it because they can't afford to have a shop. They might
I
not do
understand.
all their work down there,
Right.
but
no,
they're,
And I was going to do that, and that was the reason I was splitting it into two, and I was going to say, and if it's not commercial, the reason I was asking the questions about why a Connex can't be a shed is what we don't want to do is write another rule when there's a rule already in place,
Well,
that can
it isn't
cover
in
it. So if a
place.
Connex can be a shed, then permanent storage units, if someone wanted to buy a Connex and use it permanently, and that can be a shed, then we already have a bylaw in place. And we shouldn't try to write another one. That's why I was trying to get some clarification on the current one and why it would not, or would it prevent someone from applying for a shed permit with a Connex unit. And it sounds to me like if I walked in and said, I'm going to purchase a Connex unit, I want to use it as a shed, I want to pull a shed permit, sounds to me like that would fall under the current bylaw.
But that person would not get a certificate of appropriateness north of Route 6.
Which is a different,
Well,
I mean, say it's a different issue.
It's not fair town-wide.
No, I understand they're not fair, but we already have, that's already an issue, right? I mean, because right now, the north of
I
Route 6
disagree with that.
they rule on paint, I mean, they rule on what the exterior house can look like. That doesn't happen south of 6.
There's a lot you can't do north of 6. And when you buy property north of 6, you know that going
Right,
in.
right.
You maybe can't have a clothesline in your yard. You can never park, a camper in your yard. That's not unfair. That's, you bought in that, it's just like buying in a very exclusive homeowners association. You bought and paid for that property. You bought and paid for 6. That's fine. You're stuck with it. So I don't think that it's unfair that just because you're north of 6, you can't have that. There's a lot you can't have north of 6.
So I just,
And I reiterate, and I disagree with you, I reiterate that the people don't know all of the bylaws and everything.
That I
Okay, so
agree
when
with.
you buy a house, when you rent a car, you don't read the agreement. Okay, so you can't expect that a person who buys north of Route 6 knows all of the things that they can and can't do. Okay, and again, this is getting into, some of the minutia of this, and as Bob brought up, if it's 6 to 12, is it worth it?
right. And to me, it's like, the root cause here is not the storage containers, in my mind. The root cause is that people don't want to look at an eyesore. So you drive around town, and there's eyesores everywhere. So I feel like this is just a symptom of a bigger problem. So it's very challenging to come up with anything that's going to address this. So I'll give you an example. There's a 40-something foot wooden sailboat that's on stands out in Quaker Meeting House. Are they using it for storage? Do people like to look at it? I mean, so how do we write something where it's fair? So what about derelict boats in people's yards? So where do we stop writing the rules around it all? And my gut feel going into this, and it's why I put the flow chart together to say, to kind of help me come up with an idea, is that it's not worth the time and effort to try to write a rule when we know from the public hearing there were so many people who were very vocal about, my property, I'll do what I want on it. And I agree with that for the most part, because there's no safety issues, there's no, I have a neighbor who has a Connex in her front yard. I don't like it. I think it's, terrible to look at, but do I want to write a rule that says that nobody could have anything in their yard if I don't want to look at it?
Well, I do think that it is a matter of aesthetics, and getting back to the north versus south thing, I think that, as devil's advocate, I would say this, Sarah, yes, people buying a house in the north maybe know that they can't have certain things, but do people buying in the south realize they don't have the same protections, if you will, that the people in the north have? In other words, so if I buy a house on the south side of town, I could be exposed to anybody's bad taste in terms of what they choose to elect to call a shed, whereas if I live on the north side of town, I don't have to worry about the aesthetic of those people because that's all taken care of for me by the rules of the National Historic District. So I do think that, personally, I don't think that, it doesn't mean that people aren't going to disagree with us. It doesn't mean, 2/3 of town meeting have to agree that they believe there should be a rule that allows somebody to say, that is really ugly and I shouldn't have to look at it. And like, for example, I agree, I think a Connex is not a shed. If I had a next door neighbor who I had to look at, it looks all nice if it's brand new perhaps, but after 25 years of sitting in the weather and there's a big old rusty box sitting across the lawn that I have to look at.
Say the same for a wooden shed, doors fall off, roofs blow off.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, you might say, hey, you're going to fix your shed up, but, basically, if people go to town meeting and say, hey, it's my property, the heck with that, we're not passing any bylaws, fine. But if there are people, on the other hand, who feel like they don't get the same protections, aesthetic protections, because they don't live in the historic district and would like them, then maybe they should have a chance to, to say so as well.
Wasn't this in front of the town meeting a few years back, the same? Okay, and how close was that?
I can't remember how close it was.
From what
I believe it got a simple majority.
simple majority, okay,
Yeah.
not a super,
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
It's pretty,
I forget, we
needs a
brought it up.
two-thirds.
It needed to, I think it got,
It
It
may
passed
be-
by majority, but not two-thirds.
yeah, it had a majority, but not 2/3.
Paul, let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
Do you think these Connex containers should be regulated or need a permit for a 40-foot box to be put in someone's yard? I know the north-south thing, but overall, do you think that they should be regulated?
Brendan and I have enough regulations to regulate.
So no.
Okay, but I want to qualify that answer if I could. We, again, try to, lean on the bylaw so that if someone calls and makes that complaint, we have something to look at for them. Now, from where we were from that last town meeting when this was brought up 2 or 3 town meetings ago, or annual town meetings, whatever it was, we had the answer, and we probably will have the answer again if, in fact, this is brought before town meeting. When someone calls and makes that complaint, you know, the town meeting agreed that we shan't regulate these, so there's nothing we can do. And it's black and white.
I think because there's no definition of a shed, that it would be acceptable for somebody to use a Connex as a shed and get a permit for it as a shed. Going back to the north of 6A and south of 6A, there are many neighborhoods that have neighborhood associations which govern this kind of thing anyway. So if you want to live south of 6A and you don't want to look at a Connex, you should probably live in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association that governs those kind of things.
What if there was a size? What if there was a size requirement? I mean, not all the Connex containers are the same size.
You need a permit for a shed over 100 square feet?
Right?
Yeah, any shed, no matter what size, unless it was the box store 6x8 plastic,
Right.
that can be moved around, would require a permit. And the permit is not for building it. The permit is for placing it to comply with zoning setback.
Right.
Okay, so that we can go out and check that. If it is a shed that's 200 square feet and under, does not require a building permit, not an express permit.
Okay.
Okay, 201 square feet, it's a full building permit, because the building code then says it's a structure that warrants, you know, how you're going to attach it to the ground, how is it going to be, how is it going to stand up, et cetera. If it's under 200 square feet, build it out of balsa wood, you know, but we just have to ensure that it complies with the setbacks.
And the setbacks are typically 10 feet off a lot line?
If the shed is under 100 square feet, it's 6 feet from the front or rear, side or rear. Front, you always have to maintain your front setback from when generally that lot was created. And if it's over the 100, it's 10 feet. Just as a single-story detached garage, which could be a 40 by 60 garage, would be 10 feet from the side and rear property line.
So, right now, if someone was to purchase a 40-foot Connex, they could put it inches from the lot line, and there's no bylaw saying they couldn't do that.
A 40 by,
10.
okay, that's 400 square feet, then they would have to maintain that 10 feet from the property line.
For
They
a
would
Connex.
still always have to get the express permit for placement, not for permission to have it.
So that is on
It's
the
to-
rules
it would
right
be
now.
to place it.
So it's really duration, I think. It comes down to duration. If something's there for 6 months or less, it's temporary. If it's more than 6 months, it's permanent. So if you're there for 6 months, then you have to come up with a plan for making it permanent and then getting your permit and having your placement and putting it somewhere where it's acceptable, or finding out that you're in a historic district or whatever and you can't have one there. So I think that's really the...
Matt, we haven't heard from you. What do you got to say?
Well, I think what Bob just said was pretty good. I mean, in terms of like the personal property issue that Sarah brought up, if the issue is really just where it is rather than if it's there at all, we're not necessarily saying to someone, you have to get rid of that. We're the big bad government coming to say you can't have that in your yard. Just say, no, have it, just move it out of sight. Move it, regulate it similarly to a shed where it has to be however many 6 or 10 feet off the lot line from either the rear or the side.
So if someone had a Connex over 400 square feet, and it was inches from the lot line, you could ask them to move it then, by the bylaws now?
So what?
I think one opportunity, there might be an opportunity to restrict the size of these containers. As Paul mentioned, anything over 201 square feet would have to be built in accordance with the building code. Obviously, the Connex box that's over 200 square feet is not built in accordance with the building code. So that might be an opportunity to allow the Connex, but restrict them to 200 square feet. I don't know how else you could put a 400 square foot box and comply with the building code.
It's a quandary.
And, I mean,
One of the reasons that we have looked at the temporary storage is, twice now, this is twice, and actually, I think we did it one more time, but it never went to the town meeting, is because of, people in the historic district that have complained, people not even in the historic district that have complained, because people have taken advantage of it, and it's in your front yard. I don't think are there even a handful of complaints for anything that's in somebody's backyard? I doubt it. But it's because it's in the front yard. It's either in the driveway, it's off the side of the driveway. I think that's where this all came from to begin with, where it's either, a dumpster or a pod or whatever that's off the side of your driveway, and all of a sudden it's there for 6 months, 7 months, it's been there for a year, So it's that whole front yard,
Yeah.
and is it temporary or is it permanent? Well, obviously, if it's permanent, it shouldn't have been in your front yard to begin with. So that's teeth. And do we want to bring something forward to town meeting about, if it is in your front yard, then it's temporary and it has to be out of there within 9 months?
does it pertain to boats, unregistered boats too? I mean, I guess that's my concern is that,
Well, I don't
it's
think a
easy.
boat is considered a container.
Well, I think also one of the,
But it's unsightly.
one of the pieces, in fact, Bob, that I was going to say missing in your flow chart is, it has to be the complaint that
Triggers it.
triggers,
enforcement action,
an
right.
enforcement action. So, what I heard was a lot of people saying, well, I have like a 3-acre lot, and I have a place to put my Connex or my box or my ugly whatever, and nobody can see it, and, the answer to that is, then don't worry about it. Because if no one complains, no one's, the building inspector is not going out to seek, where can I find, an illegal shed?
Have you ever seen
It's
them
really,
poking around?
it's really, triggered by somebody's complaint. So if the homeowner is concerned that, I have a Connex, for example, but I also have a 2-acre wooded lot and nobody sees it, they should know they don't have to worry about it. Or it's tucked up behind their house and nobody can see it from the side yard, nobody can see it from the front of yard. So those are, in a sense, make all of those contexts moot. They're not going to, that's not what the problem is. This whole thing is really driven by the idea that, there are people who are troubled by what they see as, like you said, an eyesore. And is there something that can be done about the fact that I'm having to put up with an eyesore out my window? And some people say, no, there isn't, too bad, tough, and other people think, the majority of, not 2/3, but the majority of town meeting the last time agreed, yeah, there should be something that a person should be able to do if they're subjected to, that, and they don't happen to live on the north side.
Well, even on the north side, you still have eyesores.
Well, of course you do,
have,
but I know.
uncut
Right,
grass,
but,
you have,
at least at least there's an enforcement mechanism against those things that people who live elsewhere don't have. And I think they would like to have it, but let them vote. Let them vote on that. And I think that the building inspectors are correct when they say it's a very commonsensical kind of thing. Everybody knows what a shed is, and then everybody knows what a storage unit is. And going back to the original time when these rules were brought up, it wasn't so much the Connexes, it was literally those white pods that said red pod on the side that you were seeing all over town whenever it was that we brought this up, for months. And there was one, a front yard, in the middle of the historic district, in fact, that sat there for well over a year. And there was, nothing you could do. Well, I guess they could go to historic and get it removed, but, it was those kinds of, I don't know even know what to call them, a structure, that, people wanted to be able to, not have to look at.
I mean, other than the 20-foot long that I just dropped in here to have something, I think this is all pretty much in place now, right, in the flow chart? I mean, you have permanent use, you have temporary use, and it's based on duration, or, so if we need to add anything in, maybe it's a duration and a size.
Well, the other thing is, we made it very clear in the budget.
No, we don't have anything in the bylaw that says temporary.
Right, so I'm saying, so we have
Right.
to start talking about a duration to say, is it permanent or is it temporary, and then is there a size restriction?
Well, I thought that the new bylaw that was suggested acknowledged that there is a use for these things. As Paul said, if somebody's house burns down and they have to put a trailer in the yard and they have to, move what they've saved into a, or you're remodeling your house and you have to put your furniture somewhere while you remodel your house. That's the intent. Nobody's saying you can't have one of those temporary pods for that reason. That's why you have one. And you get to have one for 9 months, and if that turns out to be not enough, you get to reapply for more time. Nobody's trying to bust anybody's chops
I
around
understand.
needing a
Yep.
temporary storage pod for the purposes for
I
which
agree.
they are designed.
then when
It's
it
when they
comes down-
become permanent.
Right.
that
So what's the
there's an
line
issue.
between temporary and permanent? That's what I'm asking. is
We
to
said
say-
9 months with one
Okay.
extension
Right, okay,
in our law.
okay.
I thought that was reasonable and fair. And I would bet that even after that, if Paul went and realized, yeah, this is much slower moving than the 12 months, I'd bet he'd still give them another extension because he's not unreasonable if they were actually needed it to store their furniture while they continued to remodel their house, which took longer than they thought. I don't think that's even worth arguing about in a sense.
I think we also have to talk about whether it's in the front yard or the backyard.
Right.
That has to go along with it. So it's not just whether it's, temporary or permanent,
Well,
it's also where it's placed.
If it's temporary in the front yard, I think that's not an issue. I think the issue is if somebody brings it in under the auspices of it being temporary, puts it in the front yard, and then a year later it's still there, and 2 years later it's still there, and 5 years later it's still there. I think that to me is the issue. I think that we need to come up with wording to address or decide it's not worth addressing.
I want to go back to this. It's more than just the definition of temporary and permanent. Go back to what we've been discussing. Just use the Connex as an example. A Connex unit can be purchased and installed as a shed. It may not be what we think of as a shed, but there's nothing in the shed bylaws, I understand it, that would prevent you from using a Connex serve the purpose of a shed.
I agree.
It would have to meet all the setback requirements and any other requirements of what the shed falls under. That is in place now.
And do we think
And I
that
don't think we're being asked to write a bylaw to prevent people from using a Connex unit as a shed.
I think we are.
I don't think we are. And
Isn't that the purpose of, the fact that is it a shed, and the traditional definition of a shed is something that's more aesthetically pleasing than a Connex box?
we have a definition of a
Now,
shed.
I'm not arguing that one is better than the other. I'm just
I'm
saying.
not arguing
there are
about one
people
better than the other.
That to me, was my understanding of why we even went down this road, was to say, what are the aesthetics around what should be used as a shed and what should not be used as a shed? And I'm not going to, and in my opinion, I thought the Connex was one thing that should not be used as a shed.
I think the public hearing, it was clear everybody liked the Connex.
Well, those
Thought they were
10
good.
people that were here, I'm sure did,
Well, it was more than 10.
because they already have one.
Yeah.
But, it's how many of the other hundreds of people who, also have an opinion get to matter.
Yeah, I'm north of 6A. I was getting excited about the Connex until I was saying, boy, can't do it on the north side of 6A. So, they are good. They're historic, too. They're altered in my house. Conexes were invented in the 1950s. My house is 1970s. So it's, in some ways, it's more
Mid-century
historic than my
model.
house.
There you go.
Yeah, so.
Could work a whole look around that box.
1970s brutalist.
Are all Connex the same height?
No.
Yeah, they're basically
Or the
about
same
8
length even.
Yeah, they could get extended ones. They're pretty much the standard size, probably about 8 feet wide by 8.5 feet. That's the standard size. They come at 10,
I mean,
16,
you can do
20.
cubic feet instead of square feet, because if you say 10 by 10, someone might want to go 15 foot tall, and then that's a whole nother issue, so, you know.
Well, you know, another example is, that was brought to me personally, somebody who, complained, brought up an example of what they felt was a real eyesore in their neighborhood, and weren't sure whether they could, and that's what actually, they came and said, do you know if there's a rule around this? Is the person bought one of those old hoop houses, and then just basically laid plastic tarps with the plastic poles, around, and there was like at least 2 or 3 different colored tarps, over this
It was art.
hooped structure, in some people's eyes maybe. But, this guy was really alarmed because he goes out on his deck and all of a sudden there's a little patch of woods off his backyard, next door neighbor's backyard, that has this really ugly looking
Well, how do we regulate?
structure that he
Ugly-
calls his
Bob,
shed.
Ugly is in the eye of the beholder,
Well,
right? I mean, that's, the
Exactly.
person
So
wants
he
on his
calls that
deck.
his shed. So attempt, to me, that would not be a shed, that would be a temporary, storage unit that somebody has sort of finagled together, that
Well,
I think.
why is that not a storage unit? Why is it temporary? Because it's got
not
plastic
affixed to
on
the
it?
ground. Yeah, I guess.
Well,
Well, this is what-
wait. Sheds are not affixed. If I take a shed that's under 100 square feet, under 200 square feet, it just sits on the ground. It's not affixed to it. I can have a hoop structure that's
Well,
sitting on the ground.
I guess because I.
Because a neighbor
My-
doesn't like it.
This voter's
Because a
opinion.
neighbor doesn't like it, because they got a blue top on it, a green top on it, and a brown top.
Yeah.
They chose the 3 different colors. I don't know why, but they did. We're gonna start regulating likes and dislikes on colors? Are we gonna start regulating what trees you can put in your back? I don't like pine trees. I only like deciduous trees. I don't want the leaves there in the winter. I want to be able to see out into the ocean.
Well, I
You
think that
can't
you're-
block my
that's-
view.
I-
These are all.
That's
they're-
apple trees and orange trees.
But no, they're all arguments
Where
that
do
are
you draw the
made.
line? But
Exactly.
When the root cause is it's an eyesore, we're trying
Right.
to deal with what people call an eyesore.
Exactly.
So what is an eyesore?
So where do you, so,
So you can't
Right.
draw a line on what an eyesore is. Like, I think some of my houses, some of the neighbors' houses, the colors are ugly. But we're north of 6A, they can't change it without, the historic committee and everything else. But if they like their color and they're happy with it, then I just have to look at it because I bought my house and that's it. So
Right.
I don't see how we write any kind of a rule which is gonna address the core issue, which is people don't want to look at an eyesore. Because I understand not wanting to look at an eyesore, but I don't understand how we write a rule that allows anybody to enforce it.
I agree. It's difficult, but is the intent.
Just one more law, everything will be perfect.
No, that is the intent. Oh, please.
All right, so where are we going with this? Are we gonna walk away, or are we gonna try and do something for temporary storage facilities?
I want to ask another question, so back on the Connex again. So I drop a Connex in my front yard, and if it meets the shed requirements, and if a neighbor complained, and you were to speak to them about that Connex, one solution they would have is they could come in and get an express permit and make it legal.
If you were to put a Connex in front of your property, I don't think it would look good, Jeff, by the way.
I'd have to look at it too, so he'd have a neighbor visiting.
If the setback for that particular property was 30 feet from the front property line, and you had 60 feet from the front property line, and you put that at 33 feet lengthwise, so that you could maintain the 12-foot between structure and structure, then you would be in conformance and in compliance of the zoning bylaw as it stands now. Now I go to what Sarah's saying, okay? If it's going to be in the front yard, perhaps we should do something, okay? Our bylaw for campers, we want them to the side and toward the rear and in compliance with the zoning bylaw. Okay, so if someone came to the building department for an express permit, we would triangulate to that Connex container to ensure that it was in the zoning setbacks, and we'd be done with it. Now, we get the complaint from the neighbor that I don't like looking at that. It's in compliance with the zoning. Okay, if there's here we go. If you don't like that, then you would have to initiate a zoning bylaw to prevent that from occurring.
Okay, thanks.
So if somebody was that upset about this, that it was an issue, they could go out and they can get enough signatures in town to basically get it on the town warrant to vote for a regulation.
I think they might petition this board to
Petition this board.
bring it forward and support whatever they were petitioning for.
And just as an aside to that, I think that this board and any board would rather be proactive and have it well thought out and worded than have it go by petition.
I agree.
Petition is probably the worst rules and regulations that have ever been written, because they're written by, the heat of the moment. They're never worded correctly. They cause a lot of problems. That's why boards should always be proactive in designing these zoning regulations in a thoughtful manner. So rather than wait for some resident to go out and get enough signatures for a petition, I still think we should be working on this ourselves.
I agree, we should work on it. We have a duty as a board to do it. But as a board member, I don't totally agree that citizens always write bad rules. And I would say the group we had here did a much better job of reading what we were debating than we did. I mean, we got terrific input. They read things into it that we didn't see. Oh, you could go in this direction, that direction. Someone could interpret it this way. It could mean that. What happens in this situation? It was a tremendous amount of input that was very, very valuable.
And I think that's great. And the reason we had all that input is because this board was proactive enough to put something in front of the public, where a petition article doesn't necessarily get that. Once it's signed and in the process of being approved to go to the public, it doesn't get a public hearing.
No, I understand that. My point was that not all things written by petition are bad. Not all things written by boards are good. Because what we had presented, I think, was not a well-written.
But that's why we have a hearing.
Right.
And if
I
we
understand,
rewrite
and
it, we'll have to have another one.
I'm
Maybe we'll
supportive of
discover
being
it.
proactive, and I'm supportive of moving forward and not waiting for a petition. I was just objecting to that petitions are always bad. I don't agree. I think there are petitions that are put together by some very well-meaning groups that do a great job, that are, volunteer groups that really, they have intelligent people on them, people with high experience and so forth, so.
And I'd like to just bring back a point that I believe was brought up earlier when you asked the original question. This is, all of these bullets that Ralph has put together for the feedback for that particular few sentences that was written is typical of what Brendan and I deal with on a daily and weekly basis for an interpretation of what the bylaw means. What's the intent of the bylaw? And we are forever writing a zoning determination or opinion for something within the bylaw. So to write something in the bylaw, you would again have to write volumes of words to try to hit every possible thing that would be part of a couple of sentences or part of a definition. So it's always comes down to, Brendan or myself to interpret and to write opinion, and then if someone, again, is aggrieved, then they have the right to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals. So I think the effort to try to write something that maybe, rock solid is just too darn tough to do.
So even if we wrote something to our best of our ability, both of you are still going to have to make interpretations and use your judgment in order to determine what the intent of the rules.
Because there'll be 5 people that would come in beyond these bullets that would have thought of something that, well, good.
So attorneys
Yeah.
make a living.
How do we ever think
Yeah.
of that one? And then we deal with it at the time and try to interpret what the intent of the bylaw is.
We know that all too well with our dead-end street problem that we had.
Saw that with a
We
picture.
rewrote the dead-end street bylaw, and hopefully that'll pass. So I think, we need to put together our best foot forward on this temporary storage units, and then maybe we have to adjust it at the next town meeting, or, a few years down the road if there's a problem with it. But I think all we can do is just come up with our best wording and present it to the selectmen. If they forward it to the town meeting, so be it.
And I would take a counterpoint to that, which is I don't see the value of trying to write something that would try to clarify this based on all the possible directions it could go. And I think we should allow it to develop further. And if there are people who are really upset about it, then let them come forward and we can have that discussion at that point. But where did this originate from? Where did it start from? Did somebody complain? Did someone, who wrote this that all of a sudden it's an issue now when several years ago it didn't pass at town meeting?
This was brought to my attention and Bob's attention a few months ago by Selectman Dave Sampson, and I decided to bring it to the board because I agreed with Dave. He lives on Cove Road right off of, Ralph. Artisan, thank you. And a friend of mine used to live off Artisan as well, and driving down there myself, I noticed several containers that are the issue here, which is why I decided to bring it forward, because I didn't think it looked too good, and frankly, I didn't think it was fair to the other homeowners that their property values were being driven down because a neighbor, for whatever reason, had a storage container in their
10
front
foot
yard.
away from the property line? Or was it I mean, So theoretically, if these containers, if they came in and got a permit as a storage shed, there would be nothing to preclude them from keeping those storage sheds in a connex, whatever you want to call them, on that property. So again, I
Right.
go back to I feel like we're trying to solve a non-issue. And we're trying to come up with vague wording to solve a non-issue that's probably going to cause more downstream issues than not doing anything with it right now. And all respect to Dave, and I understand what he's going through. That's my opinion on it.
And I think that is a fair perspective to have, but I would just personally disagree, because I think that, no regulation is ever perfect, and like Paul said, we can't plan for every contingency. I'm personally a fan of what you said earlier, that regardless how specifically we regulate these, whether they be regulated like sheds or not, in terms of definitions, that we at least say, hey, we're not trying to, twist your arm. We're not saying you need to get rid of this ASAP or anything, or in X amount of months. Just move it out of sight. Just try to get it at a reasonable location so you can still use it, because I know I'm from a family that struggles financially, and I know there are plenty of other people, especially small business owners, who require these sheds and pods to do their business for whatever reason, and I don't want to step on their toes at all. But they also have to recognize that it isn't fair to their neighbors that they have to walk out every day and see something like that on their lawn, drive down their property values, and it's as simple as just moving it in the backyard.
So then, how about the neighbors in the back don't want to look at the Connex van? Do we need to write a rule then that says, well, you can't put the Connex in the backyard either? Right. Or, using Connex as a catch-all term here, but where do you draw the line to say, what's our responsibility as a board for what people consider an eyesore, and again, an eyesore is subjective. So, you know, if I see one of my neighbor's front lawn, I move it to their backyard, we force them to do that, the people in the back might have a deck looking into the backyard, and now they have to look at a Connex. So I just, that's why I keep going back and saying, I don't see how we can possibly write a rule which would address the core issue here that would be right, that would be, I don't know how else to put it, that would be right and justified.
Well, maybe because that is a good point in terms of, for instance, if there is a backyard neighbor and that does become an issue, I would just say, just as an anecdote, it could be not applicable because, you know, I'm only 20. I haven't lived around here as much as other people on this board and in this town.
Well, learn
But-
from me, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, you know, we're talking, you know, Sandwich is pretty much built out, and I know of very few neighborhoods in which there are sort of direct neighbors within a decent amount of sight of other neighbors. I know, at least myself, there is a bit of view into other people's backyards, but it's pretty well obscured by fences and by trees. But I mean, maybe that's just by my experience. Maybe it's a different story in other neighborhoods. I don't know.
I mean, it's trampolines, there's, you know, gyms, there's boats, there's so many different things that
Right.
would be considered an eyesore. So you get rid of the Connex a neighbor looks at, then they get upset because the person has a 1967 Chevy Impala with holes in it, you know? So it just, I don't know where we draw the line to deal with what I see as the core issue, which is an eyesore. So if we don't have, it's like if we can't define what a shed is, and we can't define what constitutes a shed and why a Connex would or would not be a shed, I just don't see how we can write something that's going to be good and fair.
Any other discussion? Well, I think we need to think about it and maybe come up with some ideas on paper, and, you know, maybe in another month we can look at it again. I'm open for suggestions, you know. I want to thank Paul and Brendan for coming and giving us their,
I don't know if we answered any questions.
well, you definitely
you
answered
did,
some
you
questions, yeah.
No, it was very helpful.
We know what to do with sheds, we don't know what to do with containers.
All right. And if-
Paul, would you
Don't
like
toss
to
them out
have
your window.
something
Oh,
on
one
the books for
containers.
containers?
Pardon me, ma'am?
Would you like to have something on the books for containers?
It would seem to me would make it a lot easier if a definition, you know, I don't know, the common definition of a shed is what we would commonsensically think of as a shed. And if that definition of what we perceive as a shed is also in the same definition, and it also includes a container, then it would be, you know, it would be easier, not that we're trying to make our life easier, but it would be easier for everyone else to understand that it means this, and a shed can be viewed as this container, and as long as it complies with the zoning setbacks, then you should be fine. You know, we would always tell people to, you know, when they're going to do a structure or something, just try to be as neighbor-friendly as you possibly can.
Okay, so maybe we got to look at the definition of shed and research that a little bit more. What do you think, Mr. King?
Well, I think the first question that we need to ask, before we even bother to go any further, is do we as a board feel that we need to offer remedy to people who are faced with what they see as an eyesore from their property? Do we feel as a board that we need to offer those people some kind of, or at least the opportunity for some remedy? And that 2/3 of the voters will say yay or nay.
Right.
I personally feel as if, yeah, I'm willing to do that work and to try to make that definition
I agree with you,
plausible.
too.
So,
How's that?
because I do think that there are eyesores, and I do think that it's a subjective thing, Jeff, and I do think that, you know, that's just how it is. You know what the complaints, what is being complained about, and I wonder, let me ask you this question. How many times have you been called to a scene where somebody's saying, I'm looking at an eyesore, that you disagreed and said, that's not so bad? Or how many times do you go, wow, poor them, that is an eyesore?
That generally happens, Bob, when there is an actual Hatfield and McCoy going on in the neighborhood. And we just had one recently, and it was, I think they had a peace agreement for about 16, 18 months, and now a shot has been fired somewhere, so it's back at it.
No, what I'm getting at is,
But
if
Bob,
somebody,
Bob-
let me just finish my question. If somebody calls you and says, is there anything you can do about that? How often is it that you say to yourself, I wish there was something I could do about that because I agree with these people? That seems to me to be something that's unreasonable for them to have to look at. Is that most of the time?
Yeah, we don't render opinions when we go out there. I mean, it's just...
But it's enough that you would, on the other hand, here you are saying you would like...
Bob, that's where I was going earlier when I tried to interrupt you. It's not fair to ask them, and I'm not surprised by their answer. I was going to say, I doubt, I would have bet my house on it, that you never tell someone, yeah, I agree, that's an eyesore. You can't. In the position you're in, as town officials, you can't do that. However, it's different, as you just asked them the question. They said, have you ever gone to a site and said, I wish the rules were clearer so that I could do something not in favor or against, because you can't take a position in that way. It's not your opinion. It's you are enforcing the rules as dictated by the town, and that's very important. I knew that you would say that in coming forward. So that's what's important here. As a planning board, as a member, I am in agreement with, what Scott said about maybe we should go look at the definition of shed, or maybe we should go look at some other definition, maybe some others. But as a member, I'm not willing to take on eyesore. I'm not willing to write a regulation around preventing eyesores. What is an eyesore? I have a tree that I had to take down because it was dead. There's a stump there. I might have a neighbor that doesn't like the looks of stumps. When are you going to get that stump out of your yard? It's got grass growing around it that's long and it's dead, and it's got some rot on it. I mean, it could, and I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's going to get that way. I think what we have to do is go with the sheds. I mean, the one that people talk about is storage units. So we go to sheds, and we work on the definition of sheds. And to say, and at that time we'll debate, are we going to allow them or not allow them? And if we are going to allow them, how do we allow them so that we meet, I'll say, a majority of the town's desire, right? You're never going to meet them all, but we have to meet some of them. As we've been saying, there are people that use them because for business, for storing tools, for different reasons. So how do we make it, the best we can and not prevent it? Maybe putting it in the back. But then, as Bob said, you put it in the back, you got people in the back. Matt, you mentioned about seeing it. If you go to Town Neck, those are very small lots. There's no place to put anything on your lot. You don't see it. I live in a quarter-acre lot. There's no place to put anything on my lot that my neighbors don't see it.
I guess
So but I do agree with putting it, and I think what most neighbors would agree, putting it in the back is better than the front, even on small lots. But to say someone's not going to see it, that's why we're putting it back there, that's not the case. I think just aesthetically saying, what makes the best of a situation. We can never make it perfect. But
If
what
I
do
may.
we make the best?
Yeah,
As a member, I'm okay with saying, let's go and try to tackle that.
So
But to try to tackle eyesores,
Well, I'm just a little bit confused because you just said that the aesthetics are something that you would look at, but not an eyesore. And aren't we really, I'll take the word eyesore off the table and put aesthetics on the table if that pleases you. But if you're going to, I'm confused.
let me
because
clarify what I meant by aesthetics. What I meant was, if we are going to allow a Connex unit, as an example, as a member of the board, I would be in favor of putting rules around that make it more, what I use the term aesthetically pleasing, yes.
So, but even in the whole process, Jeff, if you aren't motivated by aesthetics to even create a new bylaw, what is it that's motivating you? You said, well,
No, I
let's
didn't,
assess what
Bob,
is a
you're
shed, but
putting words in my mouth. I never used the word motivated. I said
No,
I said as a board member, let me clarify what I said. I said as a board member, I didn't want to get into defining what is an eyesore.
Right.
I didn't want to have to write a definition of
Right.
eyesore.
But you are willing to look at crafting a new bylaw based, and I won't put words into your mouth, based on what then?
I said I was willing to look at the definition of a shed, which is what Scott had offered earlier, and under that definition to look to see if we can accommodate units like Connex that would meet a larger group of town individuals' desires. That's what I said.
So if in the process you discovered that there were containers that you did not want to see approved,
not me.
What would the
It's the
standard?
town.
So basically, well, I'm a little bit confused, because if we're going to define what a shed is, how are you going to make that determination without making any value judgments around what?
I'm going to ask for
attractive
input
about
from
that?
town members. We're going to write the definition of shed, we're going to have a public hearing, we're going to invite town citizens to come in, and I'm going to listen to them. That's how I'm going to make my decision.
Won't we get to what we offer them in terms of what we believe to be our definition of a shed based on the aesthetics of what that structure is going to appear, how that structure is going to appear?
I'm going to base it upon their inputs.
Right. But after we
Right.
put out what we want as a bylaw, and then we get their feedback, and we could have it completely wrong, but I'm just confused. I guess I would expect you to say, I want nothing to do with changing the bylaw around sheds, because I can't legislate eyesore, so therefore, or anti-eyesore, so therefore, what's the purpose of even going down the road of creating a new definition?
That was me saying that, not.
Well, no, I think Jeff is saying that aesthetics and regulating what some people would consider to be an eyesore is out of the realm. I don't think that it's out of the realm. I think, in a way, it's just what the...
But I was offering...
It's commonsensical to know what's sort of an eyesore and what's an acceptable, okay structure.
All right, let's hold on for a minute. Let's listen to Ralph for a second.
All right. I'm just trying to get direction on which way to move on this. And I think if you're moving forward, and I'm just boiling it down to its simplest point, that if a structure, if a storage unit is going to be permanent, you want to see it within the setbacks. If something's outside of the setbacks, then we consider it temporary. Is that, I mean, did I sort of encapsulate the very beginning?
To me, I think it's a duration issue, and I'm willing, even though I disagree with this, to help craft wording that would potentially work. So to me, it's a
So,
duration.
whether within or outside of the setbacks, or outside of the setbacks?
If it's there for.
Inside the setbacks, it's temporary. We'll start looking at permanent things, and outside the setbacks, as a pod would be, as a storage container for only 9 months. I mean, I'm trying to get a sense, because, as the discussion went, we're discussing front yard, backyard, and it does boil down to setbacks, and it seemed like you were okay if it was temporary and if it was in the front yard. But and then the discussion starts going about connexes, and if the storage unit, if it falls, if it's going to be longer than 9 months or permanent, you want, out of a sense of fairness, it has to fall within the setbacks as if you had a normal shed or any accessory structure. And if I could use that as a takeaway for a starting point, I think
There's two different items here: temporary storage and permanent storage.
right.
And we need to define the two.
Okay,
Temporary storage, meaning not having any setbacks.
Right.
It's temporary.
right,
And the permanent storage would be required to be setback compliant.
Okay.
Because the temporary, if somebody's house burned down and they needed to place dumpsters and storage units and a mobile home on that lot while their house was rebuilt, and it necessitated them putting it closer to the, they couldn't do the setbacks and leave room for the construction crew to get in and out and get their house rebuilt. Of course, that's a temporary situation. They shouldn't have to worry about their setbacks. The trailer's there temporarily, the storage unit's there temporarily, the dumpster's there temporarily while they rebuild their house. And worrying about having setbacks is the last thing they need to worry
Right,
about.
no setback.
On the other hand, if somebody decides, well, I'm going to buy a Conex or a shed or any basically shed thing they're going to call a shed, all of us have to go and get an express permit to make sure we're placing it on our property, that's our property, and deep, and away from the proper, distance from the lot line.
Sarah, do you have any comments?
No, I'm all set.
Okay.
We need, the only comment is we need to think more about it and come back.
Right, I'll take a motion.
Why? It's just more discussion.
so, yeah.
Okay, well, we want to bring it up on another meeting?
You could just tell us when you want it, when you set the agenda.
Right.
Or whatever.
Yeah,
I'm not going to be here for the April 17th meeting. I have a business trip, so apologize.
I'm not
I'm
going
not
to be here
around
on
it.
first because I'm out of town.
just to let you know, nothing has come in yet for the April 17th meeting, and the deadline has passed for, was March 27th, so
Okay.
unless, like, an A&R comes up.
Right. Last time we canceled the meeting, something came up, it was brought into the
Well, we don't have to
clerk's,
cancel it until the end.
Right.
No, I'm just
won't
letting
I
you
don't
know.
want to cancel it
I'll
because
be-
we did that once
We
before.
won't
We all
cancel it.
come in on a weird day, and so.
Well, this has to do about the, from the Mass DEP.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't see that.
Oh, the Mass DEP for the,
Yeah.
for,
Do you want to address that?
if you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it seems
Yeah.
to be handing planning boards across the state more
Right.
jurisdiction.
Right, to comment on the piers and docks. So what's going to happen is that they would send you the application and the public notice, which you would review, and if you have any comments, you would send it into the DEP. So that's pretty much in a nutshell. And then the second thing, I know Bob, Jeff, and Bob had gone to the HAC, the Housing Assistance Corporation courses over the fall. But just to let you know, there's an Affordable Housing Trust Cape Housing Roundtable in Dennis on April 5th, this Thursday. If any of you were interested in going, RSVP was by today, but I'm sure if you wanted to you could give him a call tomorrow. If you need the information, I have it.
All right, well, thank you, Ralph.
Sure.
So,
Make a motion to adjourn.
okay, I just want to
Second.
thank you again for coming here tonight.
Oh, yeah.
We have a motion
Second.
and a second. All in favor, adjournment?
Aye.
Aye.